saya mau bilang begitu deg-degan banget.
The Honorable Dean Faculty of Law Universitas Hasanuddin, Profesor Dr. Hamzalim SHMH MAP.
Yang terhormat, Dekan Fakultas Hukum Universitas Hasanuddin, Bapak Profesor Dr. Hamzah Halim SHMH MAP.
The Honorable Guest Speaker of Studium Generale on Localizing the Human Right Best Approach to Fight Corruption, the Role of Pancasila Values, Dr. Prosper S. Magocho LLM from Freie University.
Yang terhormat, pembicara tamu Studium Generale tentang melokalkan pendekatan berbasis hak asasi manusia untuk melawan korupsi, peran nilai-nilai Pancasila, Bapak Dr. Prosper S. Magucu, LLM dari Freie University.
The Honorable Vice Deans, Head of Departments, Head of Study Programs, and also participants who attended in the session.
Yang terhormat, para dekan, para wakil dekan, ketua departemen, ketua program studi, serta seluruh peserta yang hadir pada acara Studium Generale ini.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Shalom,
Om Swastiastu.
Namo Buddhaya.
Good morning to all of us. Welcome to Studium Generale on Localizing the Human Right Best Approach to Fight Corruption, the Role of Pancasila Values, conducted by Faculty of Law Universitas Hasanuddin.
Selamat datang di Studium Generale tentang melokalkan pendekatan berbasis hak asasi manusia untuk melawan korupsi, peran nilai-nilai Pancasila yang dilaksanakan oleh Fakultas Hukum Universitas Hasanuddin.
First of all, let us offer praise and gratitude for the presence of God. Because of His grace and mercy, so we can gather today and this event to attend the Studium Generale on Localizing the Human Right Best Approach to Fight Corruption, the Role of Pancasila Values.
Pertama-tama, marilah kita panjatkan puji dan syukur kehadirat Tuhan karena atas rahmat dan izinnya sehingga kita dapat berkumpul hari ini untuk menghadiri Studium Generale dengan tema melokalkan pendekatan berbasis hak asasi manusia untuk melawan korupsi, peran nilai-nilai Pancasila.
Therefore, let us start the event together by saying Basmalah.
Marilah memulai acara ini dengan mengucap basmalah.
Let's move to our first agenda, which is singing Indonesia Raya. We humbly please all participants for standing up while the anthem was playing.
Agenda selanjutnya, menyanyikan lagu kebangsaan Indonesia Raya. Kepada para peserta, dimohon untuk berdiri.
All participants may take a seat.
Hadirin disilahkan duduk kembali.
Let's hear the welcoming remarks by the Dean Faculty of Law Universitas Hasanuddin, Professor Dr. Hamzah Halim SH MH MAP, and also to officially open the event. To Professor Dr. Hamzah Halim SH MH MAP, time is yours.
Mari bersama-sama untuk mendengarkan sambutan Dekan Fakultas Hukum Universitas Hasanuddin, sekaligus melaksanakan pembukaan kegiatan ini secara resmi. Kepada Bapak Profesor Dr. Hamzah Halim SH MH MAP, waktu dan tempat dipersilahkan.
Baik, terima kasih. The Honorable Dr. Prosper S. Magucu, LLM, from Vrije University, Amsterdam, Netherlands. I am very, very happy because you're coming in my faculty. Thank you very much, Prof. Prosper. I'm sorry I have to read my notes. The Honorable Head of International Cooperation, Dr. Birka Latif, SH.MH LLM, the Honorable Lecturers of Law Faculty of Hasanuddin University, PhD candidates, and all the participants. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and good morning. It is an honor for Law Faculty of Hasanuddin University to welcome Dr. Prosper S. Magucu, LLM, from Vrije University, Netherlands, to our beloved campus. Last year we visit Vrije University, and this year we are very happy that Dr. Prosper Magucu, as part of Vrije University, come visit our campus. We do hope they will the call maintain and improve our partnership and build more collaboration in the future. In this occasion, we are grateful that Dr. Prosper Magucu are able and willing to share his knowledge in today's guest lecture, Localizing the Human Rights-Based Approach to Fight Corruption, the Role of Pancasila Values. These certain issues is certainly raised so many debates in the academia. And this occasion, Dr. Prosper is willing to give you his perspective with a connection to our Indonesian values, which is Pancasila. I hope that all participants can learn and take advantage of the precious opportunity to learn and improve their knowledge in this matter. Thank you very much. And by the end of this speech, I officially open this guest lecture. I wish you all enjoyable lecture. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and good morning.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Hamzah Halim SH MH MAP, for his remarks and willingness to open the Studium Generale on localizing the human right-based approach to fight corruption, the role of Pancasila values. The welcoming remarks from Dean Faculty of Law also ends the opening ceremony. With all respect, we please Dean Faculty of Law to take a seat.
Terima kasih kepada Bapak Profesor Dr. Hamzah Halim SH.MH MAP atas sambutan dan kesediaan untuk membuka Studium Generale tentang melokalkan pendekatan berbasis hak asasi manusia untuk melawan korupsi, peran nilai-nilai Pancasila. Dengan berakhirnya sambutan dari Bapak Dekan Fakultas Hukum Universitas Hasanuddin, sekaligus menutup rangkaian pembukaan acara ini. Kami dengan hormat mempersilahkan Bapak Dekan untuk kembali ke tempat yang telah disediakan.
That was the opening ceremony. Here we are going to the main agenda of today's activity, which is material presentation of Studium Generale by the speaker, Dr. Prosper S. Maguchu, LLM. This agenda will be led by Mrs. Mutia Wenda Junior SHLLM as the moderator.
Itulah upacara pembukaan Studium Generale menuju agenda utama pada kegiatan hari ini, yakni pemaparan materi Studium Generale oleh Dr. Prosper S. Maguchu, LLM. Agenda ini akan dipimpin oleh Ibu Mutia Wenda Junior, SHLLM, sebagai moderator.
Without any further ado, I call Mrs. Mutia Wenda Junior, SHLLM to moderate the session.
Untuk itu, saya mengundang Ibu Mutia Wenda Junior, SHLLM, untuk memoderatori sesi kali ini.
Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and good morning everyone. My name is Mutia Wenda Junior and I will be the moderator for the sessions. Sorry. So the Honorable of the Dean of the Faculty of Law Hasanuddin University and also the Honorable of the Head of Department of International Law as well as the Head of the International Corporation, Ibu Dr. Birka Latif. So for today, we are going to have a guest lectures by the Dr. Prosper S. Maguchu. And then he is currently the Associate Professor at the Free University of Amsterdam. And he is the International Coordinator for the Anti-Corruption Act, Southern Africa. Previously, Dr. Prosper also worked as a senior project lawyer with the Zimbabwe Human Rights Forum, specializing in public interest litigation on behalf of torture and organized violence victims. Also, Dr. Prosper also teaches anti-corruption law, business, and human rights as a guest at summer schools in university in Africa and Europe. He holds a master's degree in transnational criminal justice and a doctorate on transitional justice, corruption, and human rights. And his main research interests are in financial crimes with the human rights-based approach. He has written and published in peer-reviewed journals as well as the several books chapters on this area, such as challenges of money laundering for sovereign states that uses the US dollar, the role of the civil society organization in asset recovery, and the contesting normative space, the status of African traditional courts under international human rights law. And for today, he's going to give lectures with the topic Localizing the Human Rights-Based Approach to Fight Corruption, the Role of the Pancasila Values. If I'm not mistaken, you have write about this based on the African values, right?
Exactly.
Yes, I've seen, I've read your articles about that, and I think it's very interesting because in this sessions you are going to share about the Pancasila values. So I think this is gonna be very insightful lectures by the Dr. Prosper. So without further ado, I'm going to give the time for Dr. Prosper. Please, time is yours.
Okay, Honorable Dean, all protocols observed. Ladies and gentlemen, students, I'm really pleased to be sharing my new research paper with you. So why did I say new research paper? Because the Pancasila aspect of it, I'm also a student, and I'm hoping that at the end we'll get some enough contributions, discussion that will help shape the paper. This is the paper that I intend now that I'll be co-authoring with Dr. Latif. But I've written already the paper, same topic, same context, focusing on the role of what is called Ubuntu, which is an African, sub-Saharan African philosophy. I'll get more into that. Let me just, before I jump gun, begin with by giving you an overview of the next 1 hour. Do we have 1 hour, right? So the next 1 hour, what I intend to share with you within the next 1 hour. So if we can go to the next slide. Yeah. So yeah, just a brief introduction to the topic, and maybe also demystifying some myths and facts about corruption. As you probably know, those who are in the field of anti-corruption, that it's a field that is prone to misconceptions. Yeah, it is full of hyperbole. when people say corruption is a crime against humanity, yeah, corruption is cancer, these are hyperbolic statements. Or corruption, yeah, but can you actually go to court and say, there's been a violation of crime against humanity because of corruption? So that's another question. It's also something that happens in secrecy most of the time. Corruption happens behind closed doors and drawn curtains. So what we tend to measure, like the measurements of corruption, they are perceptions. Yeah, it's not the actual thing, but we'll get into that. So I want us to have a small game where we'll demystify some misconception about corruption and also about corruption and human rights. Because when we start talking about corruption and human rights, some people, when I started writing about this topic more than 5 years ago, I was ridiculed by people who probably misunderstood some of the questions that we were asking, together with other colleagues who are involved in this project. Then we'll discuss maybe just a little bit definition of corruption, and then go to the link between corruption and human rights. And we'll finish with just a brief introduction of how we will structure the paper on Pancasila values as a solution. I'll put it in a question mark. Do we think it could be a solution to address corruption? Time permitting, we may also go into corruption perceptions and the SDGs. Otherwise, we'll just go straight into concluding remarks and give more time for some question and answers. Again, please feel free at any time to interrupt. If you have something that you have a question or you want to add a point, just raise your hand, just interrupt me at any time. And before I proceed now to the game, is everything clear? Any violent objections or we are all good, right? Okay, so then let's proceed to the next game. So if we all have smartphones, can we please go to www.menti.com? Yeah, Menti. So unfortunately, I may be the only one who will be watching the results, but let me try to share my screen. I've lost connection. Can someone help me with internet on my computer? Are you? So I'm the one who's supposed to see the results here. How do I share?
So this is the code 1624522, please. 1624522.
Ah, yes. Yeah, the results are coming. So, let's see. Yeah, we can see the results are coming. Can we, we see how many people have answered? One, yes, Indonesia needs good political will to make education about anti-corruption value start from early childhood education. Good. Yes, death penalty. Somebody is suggesting death penalty. Yeah, and can you read the other one that is in Bahasa for me?
Which one?
There's a comment.
Okay. Yeah. The solution is for the legal enforcement and the reform of the law.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, that's so legal enforcement.
Yes.
One is most strategic one is to give the big consequence punishment to the corruptor and impoverish them, prison for being long life, or even take them to erase their political right. Okay. Integrity. Yeah. Perhaps we must have to realize that the conditions must start for our first before, okay? Educate millennials and reconstruction of the bureaucracy, okay? Yeah. Changing suspect assets. Oh, yeah. Taking the suspect assets, forfeiting them to the state in accordance with the law. Okay, so many, I think we can, yeah, there's absolute freedom of speech, and yeah, okay, also freedom of speech is important. So talking about human rights and corruption. So yeah, different answers have been given. Yeah, I'm sure you can see some of them. We can do this exercise, but let's now continue, but very good answers. And I think we are going to make reference to some of them as we go on. Good answers. Now, if I should stop sharing, then we go back to okay, thank you. So this question that I'm asking today was actually subject to, I find it in one of these, one of the local papers. I think last year in December, we know December 9th, is it December 9th? Every 9th of December, the world commemorates International Anti-Corruption Day. So that is the International Anti-Corruption Day. And then on the 10th, we have the International Human Rights Day. The fact that these 2 days follow each other is not by coincidence anyway. It also serves to illustrate the link between corruption and human rights. So we commemorate anti-corruption on the 9th and on the 10th, human rights. And what happened last year on the commemoration of Anti-Corruption Day, this ministry here, the BPIP, also made a suggestion that, we could actually find some values we could apply the values of Pancasila to eradicate corruption. Yeah, very interesting points. You also made another point that is quoted over there, that corruption is detrimental to the nation and state. So it is even considered an extraordinary crime. Very important statements that I want us to keep let's keep this at the back of our minds as we progress with this session today. But so this is where our research question comes from. So should we, or can we, first, should we, and can we do it? What value does it add to include the Pancasila in fighting corruption? So these are the questions that we'll try to address in the next presentation. Hopefully that will be turned into a paper. So before we even talk about corruption, like which type of corruption and so forth, it is always important that we begin by defining what we actually mean by corruption. And pardon me if I become a little bit academic. Academics, whenever they find themselves in a conversation, they always want to start by, how do you define so-and-so? How do you define so-and-so? But it is important, very important, especially when it comes to corruption. Why? Because so far there's no consensus on the universal understanding of what corruption means. So what may be defined as corruption here may not be defined as corruption in other countries. And for the purposes of our presentation of our paper, we have reviewed 3 main types of definitions. So these are the 3 main types of definitions that have been given on different types of corruption. Before we don't move to the next slide, please. I want to ask if there's any volunteer who wants to try to give a definition of corruption. So what is corruption in your understanding? Yeah, who wants to give a try? Yes, sure.
Hello, everyone. I think corruption means that not everyone or nobody equal before law.
Okay.
Maybe some people has some people have authority to make things against law,
Okay.
and they maybe will be protected by government, but some people maybe be weak and they cannot make things against law. Maybe will government punish them. The meaning I want to give you that not all people equal before law.
Not all people equal before the law. So that's definition of crime. Ladies and gentlemen, do you not mind me giving this lecture standing? It's very difficult to talk when you're sitting. So, yeah. Anybody also who have another definition? Any other definition? Yes, sure.
Getting rich by stealing from the country.
Yes. So corruption is getting rich by stealing from the country. Very good. Two good examples that we are giving. Now let's review our definition. Yeah. So one of the most common definition that has been handed down or that has been given when it comes to corruption is what falls under the class of public office. You know, public office, stealing, getting rich by stealing from the country. To get access to the country riches, you should be a public official, right? Yeah. Oh, really? Okay, we'll get more deep into that. How you can steal. Okay, but so definitions, but very good point. Very good point. I will come back to that in a minute. Public office definitions, they focus on those working for the state. So they link corruption to public officials acting out of private regard. So we have a public official, instead of doing what he's supposed to do, he's doing things that will line his pocket. This definition, there's a problem with it. He just mentioned it. You don't have to be a public official to be corrupt. Even people outside the public office can also be involved in corruption. So this definition is a little bit out. It doesn't really help us to fight corruption. So that's the other challenge. And most countries, by the way, are still using this definition, which is very narrow. And I want to come back to the point that was raised here, that corruption means nobody is above the law, or corruption should, at least, if a corruption-free society, everybody should be under the law, right? Yeah, nobody should be above the law. So what we have is that we have certain people who are not covered by the law, or we have public officials who can also make the law to protect their corrupt activities, their corrupt means, unscrupulous ways of behavior, you know, things like that. But we'll come back to that second definition. We have also the abuse of power definition, also more or less linked to what you said. Abuse of power definitions, they don't talk about the person involved. So they talk about, you know, somebody, whether you are public or you are private, you do not do what you're supposed to do. You used the power that you have in an unscrupulous way, again, for the purposes of enriching yourself or your friends or your colleagues, you know, yeah. So the meaning is a little bit expanded. So it's no longer just a public official. It includes anybody who abuses office for private gain. So these are abuse of power definitions. Again, this abuse of power definition, although it seems to have expanded the definition of corruption, it still does have some limitations with it. You know, when we say abuse of power, what about other means that are not necessarily abuse of power? But let's go to the next definition. The third definition that we find that is available in literature is decay definitions. So decay definitions, this definition, they relate corruption to institutional or individual decay. So the original definition of corruption, the word itself, corruption, is an adaptation from Latin word corruptio, which simply means decay. I don't know, how do you say corruption in Bahasa? What? Corrupti. Corrupti. So corrupt means, yeah, so that means decay. So decay, the definition of corruption in Bahasa is much broader than the public definition that I've said, the public office or that abuse of office definition. So in Bahasa, corruption means decay. It means, you know, anything that is wrong, morally, it doesn't have to be some sort of abuse of power. Anything that's just wrong is corruption. In my mother tongue too, by the way, corruption means huwori, which means decaying. They never had any connections. My ancestors never had any connections with Indonesians, but they have a common understanding on what corruption means. It means decay. They also never had any contacts with the Greek people who came up with this definition, corruptio. I don't know in Gambia, how do you define corruption? In your mother tongue?
Kawalat at the same thing like corruption. Yeah. Doing things that are against morally against the norm.
Exactly. So it's much more deeper than just public office definition or these definitions that we are given or handed to us by Bretton Woods institutions. I mean, the International World Bank and the IMF. So they give us definitions of corruption that would serve only an interest of protecting multinational corporations when they are doing business in this part of the world. But the actual definition of corruption, decay, you know, is the definition that can help us to get rid of corruption from a very grassroots level. All right, let's go next. So I hope now we have a common understanding of the definition. Because there is no universal consensus on what exactly corruption is. There are just a list. So the United Nations Convention Against Corruption has come up with a list, and other actors as well. I've shared with you some of the corrupt practices. The list is just endless, you know, from the most common one, bribery. Many people actually confuse bribery and corruption. Bribery is just one specific type of corruption. When you are paid something, you know, paid sweet money or grease money. I don't know what is the local term for a bribe here? Say, what do you call a bribe? Swap. Yeah. So bribery, it's when you get something, yeah, you pay something or gratuities, you know, the kickbacks, concealment, there is extortion. Laundering can also be regarded as corruption. So depending on whether you are talking about money, whether you are talking about assets, you know, misappropriation of assets, if you take something that belongs to your work and you took it home and use it as your personal thing, that's also corrupt. It's corrupt behavior. That's chiseling different terms. When it comes to people, they are also, so all these categories, money, assets, people, power, all these can show different acts of corruption. So the definition or the practices of what can be regarded as corruption, the practices are just endless. So this is just to give you an overview of what we are trying to mean by corruption. But in this presentation, so we are going to put all this in one bracket. So how do we use the Pancasila values to fight any of these acts and any that will come in the future? Corruption is a moving target, by the way. So regardless of what I said about legging of a definition, it is still okay that way, that we don't pin it down to a specific definition, like the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, which says that corruption, you know, the definition should remain open. So each state can decide what it wants to punish as corruption. And as I've always said, corruption is like a moving target. It changes speed and height at the same time. So what can be corruption today, tomorrow it mutates and it comes up back in a different form. Now with the advent of internet, we now have some new forms of corruption. Online, you get emails, you know, thinking you are talking to somebody else, yet you are talking to a different person altogether. Or you get somebody who send you an email that looks really legitimate when actually money is channeled also. So even new forms of corruption are coming as we are speaking. So we just put it in that category and then try to come up with solutions on how we can deal with these categories using the Pancasila values. Now that we have a sort of common understanding, if we can move to the next slide. Yeah. So, all right. So for the purposes of this talk again, so when we're talking about corruption and human rights, because we are now talking about law, so we need to have a definition, one that we can use with certainty, you know, what's called legal certainty, one that you can use if you are to take a case before judges to say that because of these certain acts of corruption or because of bribery, because of misappropriation, my individual rights have been violated. So we need to have a proper definition. And I mentioned the UNICAC, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, has given us a list of crimes and also a leeway to come up with different other crimes. There are also international conventions. Maybe if you go back again to that slide, sorry, I'm confusing here. Yeah. So there's bullet point number 3. Sorry, I want just to say something before I move to the, yeah, there are certain conventions, by the way, that try to come up with a definition of corruption, but otherwise there's really no clear-cut, universal accepted definition. But yeah, with that common understanding of corruption, let's now try to see where does human rights come from. And then we move now to this next slide. So I hope if there are any questions on the definition, we could actually discuss anything. Anybody wants to say something about the definition, or we move to the next part. So until very recently in the 1900s, major studies on corruption, they were influenced by either economics or politically, socially, even culturally, you know, like some people, scholars, we're looking at whether corruption is an Indonesian or an Asian thing, or is it an African thing. So they were doing all sorts of, you know, experiments when it comes to corruption. Why are certain countries more corrupt than others and so forth? It is only very recently that they also started to look at corruption from the lenses of human rights, what has been called human rights-based approach. So they want to understand if corruption can be linked to the issue of human rights, because all these other methods, they haven't yielded any results, by the way. So before, there were others who came up with these very interesting theories that there are certain communities or certain cultures that allows, you know, that promotes corruption. But still, that hasn't helped to change or, you know, limit corruption. So now they think that it's time to come up with a new framework on fighting corruption. So even international conventions such as the United Nations Convention Against Corruption does have a specific provision of employing a human rights-based approach to fighting corruption. And today we are going to ask the question, so if we are going to fight corruption using a human rights-based approach, which particular area of human rights? And I'll get into that again. Sorry, because now I'm just jumping, but I'll just want us to get this basic idea, and then we get straight into the discussion. So let's go again to the next slide. Yeah. So and the relationship between corruption and human rights is now very fashionable. So it's now fashionable to talk about corruption, to link corruption to human rights violations. Although there's still no clarification of exactly what is it that we are looking at? What does it mean when we say corruption is related to human rights, or let's employ a human rights-based approach to fighting corruption? So there's still need for some conceptual, empirical, and you know, there's still some normative gaps. So we still need some research in this area to come up with a specific, you know, framework on how human rights system, as we know, the human rights system with all its international codes, special procedures, how can we employ the same mechanism in fighting corruption? Then we go into the next slide. No, just skip that one. Yeah. Yes. So, and now in a nutshell, to show you the relationship between corruption and human rights, it's quite a bit complicated. So there are different theories that have been suggested on how corruption is linked to human rights, or the nexus, that connection between corruption and human rights. And it can be at best be illustrated in this form, that we have some very extreme ideas at both ends of the conundrum. So in the mid, well, let me start with the first one. So we have the weaker version of corruption and human rights nexus, promoted by organizations such as the United Nations. They talk about, use phrases such as corruption has negative impact on human rights, or corruption undermines human rights, or that it has a grave and devastating effect, or phrases such as corruption is a significant obstacle to the enjoyment of human rights. Do you have anyone studying human rights law? Do you see where the problem is? Okay. If we say corruption has a negative impact on human rights, can you go to court and argue a case that your right has been violated? Was that a hand up? Yeah, yeah, sure. I think your hand was first. So say corruption has a negative impact on human rights, or that corruption facilitates human rights. Can you then go to court and say, my rights have been violated because of corruption? Yeah?
Yes, I can refer with the answer of Mr. Abdurrahman that say that why then human right is very relates with the corruptions, because when the corruptions is applied, it can make another people opportunities to access public facilities, for example, or how should government allocate this certain amount of money to serve the country or to serve the people can be leaked, for example, and it kind of affect our society to not access those money well.
Okay, yeah, so that's one thing, the resources then that should be used towards human rights, but we get to that. So just in a short, so when we say corruption has a negative impact or undermines, human rights, you can't go to court and argue that my human right, corruption has a negative impact. That's not the same as corruption is a violation of human rights. So they are not admitting. Organizations such as the United Nations are just using weak vocabulary to link corruption to human rights. They say corruption undermines, it facilitates, but they don't want to say that it causes the violation of human rights in and of itself. We skip to that part. We go to others who are on the other end. We have those who are saying we are using weak languages to connect the two. Then we have others who are at the other extreme end. They actually believe that there should be a fundamental right, which is freedom from corruption. They believe that it is our right as individuals to be free from corruption. So they push for what they call freedom from corruption. So it's still a fundamental human right that is under some sort of discussion, doctrinal level. It isn't really, it's not protected by any international treaty or instrument. But there are other scholars, practitioners calling for a new human right, which is called freedom from corruption. In today's presentation, we are not going to push for that, a very extreme, otherwise utopian idea, very good idea, but we are not pushing for that one. We are simply saying that corruption as it is today, those different acts that I showed you on that slide, bribery, misappropriation, all those forms of corruption, they are a violation of recognized human rights in and of themselves. And I'll give you examples of how it happens. So we are not pushing for a new human right. We are simply saying that corruption as it exists today, under certain condition, it can lead to a violation of human rights, of your fundamental rights. And now here's why. Here is how corruption can lead to fundamental human rights. Yeah. Yeah. So, as I said, there are certain conditions. So to apply this human rights framework, it is, that is to say, to see the effect of corruption and human rights, first we need to distinguish ways in which corruption can violate human rights directly. So as I said, that corruption as it is can lead to human rights violation. So this can be direct corruption practices, embezzlement, or bribery, directly violating a human rights. There are also ways in which corruption can indirectly lead to human rights. It leads to a violation of human rights but not on its own. It is among other reasons that leads to the violation of human rights. Then we also need to show the causal link, between a specific act of corruption and a violation of human rights. So this is just to give you an overview. Now let's look at it completely. Let's look. So the first one, if you can skip this, it's also fine. We can then go to, So we need also, first of all, to understand the obligations of states when it comes to human rights. So in order to apply that framework. So states, as I'm sure those who are doing human rights, that states, they have 3 duties: to respect, to protect, and to fulfill. So each state, like Indonesia, it has a duty towards its citizens to respect their rights, to protect their rights, to make sure that your rights are also not violated by anybody else, but also to fulfill them when it comes to socioeconomic rights, for example. So they should make sure they build enough schools so that you guys can come to university. They should make sure that there is enough food so that you can be fit, to come to university, medication and so forth, so that you lead your life. So there is also a duty to fulfill. So knowing these 3 duties, the 3 duties that are owed by the state to its individual, and see how acts of corruption can lead to a violation of respect, protect, and fulfill. This is the best way you can then make that link between corruption and the violation of human rights. So you need first of all to understand the duties that are owed by the state to its citizens. So there are 3 levels of state obligations. And now if we so a violation of human rights due to corruption can occur under 2 conditions. So there can be a failure to act or to conform toward the state's obligation to respect, protect, or fulfill recognized human rights of persons under its jurisdiction. This is the failure to act. So to take an example that was given earlier, let's think of the right to education. So you have the right to education, and there is a ministry of the Ministry of Education is allocated budget, let's say, for argument's sake, 50 billion rupees. And if the minister takes some of this, let's say 10 billion, channel it towards somewhere else, that means that there isn't enough, so he hasn't fulfilled, that duty to fulfill by providing that money towards, the fulfillment of education. That money is no longer available, and that has affected your right to education. So, and this works very well when we are talking about socioeconomic rights. As maybe you may know, so socioeconomic rights, they are enjoyed subject to the availability of resources. So that's another provision under international human rights law, that we can enjoy socioeconomic rights subject to the availability of resources. And each government, of course, has an obligation to progressively realize these rights, socioeconomic rights. We cannot expect a country that is still developing to offer the same level of education as one that's fully developed. But however, each country does have the obligation to make sure that they progressively make resources available for the enjoyment of human rights. If those resources are no longer available, not only because there isn't much that the state is producing, but because some people are in the habit of channeling those resources elsewhere, then that can be a violation of the obligation to fulfill fundamental rights. So if we go to the next slide. Yeah. And also another important aspect that we need to know, having said that there are 3 obligations, that these human rights, they are interconnected and interdependent. So with human rights, whether we are talking of the right to education or we are talking of the right to health, these rights are interdependent, they are interconnected and interdependent. So the violation of one right can also lead to the violation of another. And when it comes to the link between corruption and human rights, you don't need to show only the violation of one right, because that can also, it's needless to show that corruption has led to the violation specifically of one right. Since you can link, for example, the lack of medication in school, medication in hospitals can affect your health, which can then also have an impact on your availability to attend class. So you need also to illustrate that interdependent and interconnected, the interconnected and interdependence of human rights. So it is crucial in this regard to understand the different norms, procedures, and institutional machinery that is essential for the protection and realization of human rights. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah. Now to give examples of how corruption can be involved with human rights violations. So as I said, there are 3 different ways in which corruption can be involved in violation of human rights. The first one will be direct violations. So this is where an act of corruption leads directly to the violation of human rights without any break in between. And I'll give an example of, let's say, a bribe. So if somebody offers a bribe to a judicial officer and you don't get a free trial as a result of, a judge that has been paid a bribe, that is a direct violation of your human right to fair trial because of bribery. So there is a clear connection between the payment of a bribe to a judge and the denial of your right to fair trial. So you can see under these circumstances that corruption has led directly to the violation of a human right. So this is an example of direct violation of human rights by corruption. You pay a bribe and to a police officer to force somebody to admit to have stolen from you. That's also a direct, there is a direct link between payment of a bribe and torture. So corruption can lead directly to human rights violations under these certain circumstances. And the second one will be indirect violations. So when corruption is a necessary condition. So the second way, excuse, what is happening? I see many people leaving. Is it boring or there's another session that started somewhere? There's some consulting happening. Okay, sorry. So maybe I need to change the pitch. All right, let's do this again. So corruption and human rights. I said you can link corruption to human rights violations via 3 ways. One is direct violations, where you can show that an act of corruption has directly led to the violation of human rights. An example would be a bribe paid to a public official and directly leads to the violation of your human rights. The second way to show that connection between corruption and human rights is indirect violations. This is where corruption is not alone in the violation of human rights, but is a necessary condition that triggers the violation of a human right. I can give an example of a government official who is paid by a corrupt, let's say a corrupt company pays a government official to dump waste in a way that is not responsible. So in this case, you can say because a company or an unscrupulous company paid a government official to dispose waste and it eventually finds its way into your drinking water and you fell ill. If it was not for that act of allowing a company to dump irresponsibly waste into your drinking water, the violation could not have happened. So corruption is amongst other many reasons that have led to the violation of human rights, but this is indirect. And as you know that human rights can be violated both directly and indirectly. So under the second scenario where corruption is involved indirectly in the violation of human rights, corruption is but a necessary condition that has led to the violation of your human rights. So to distinguish this with the first one, there is an act of corruption and there is a violation of human rights. There is no clean any break in between. Payment of a bribe leads directly to the violation of your human rights. Under the second scenario here, where it's indirect, corruption is among other factors that can help, that leads to the violation of your human rights. But as I said, even without a direct connection, you can safely say here with legal certainty, go to court and argue that my right to health has been violated in this situation because a government official accepted a bribe to allow irresponsible ways of dumping toxic things in the water that we drink. So this is just another example, but you can come up with any form of example to illustrate how corruption can be indirectly involved in the violation of human rights. And the third one would be remote violations. So remote violations, so this again, when corruption is one factor among other factors that would lead to the violation of human rights. And I can think of an example would be, let's say there's been an election. So there's an election, you believe that an election is rigged. So the government rigs an election, people decide to go on a demonstration, and as they are demonstrating, police use unnecessary force, and you are injured during that use of unnecessary or excessive force. In this case, although there was a rigging of an election, which is the main corrupt element, and you being injured because of some excessive force that was used, corruption is among many other factors that were involved. So you can not really, it's difficult to show how corruption has been involved in the violation of your human rights. It's remotely connected to your violation of human rights. So the rigging of an election, that corrupt act of rigging an election that caused you to go and demonstrate, and then eventually you were then injured during the demonstration. There are too many breaks. There is no what we call causal connection in law to link the stealing of an election and the violation of your human rights. So this is where most academics, even practitioners, they have problems when we talk about the link between corruption and human rights, because they sometimes think that it's these two, corruption and human rights, are remotely connected in such a way that it will be useless, or it's not possible to go to court and argue that corruption can be indeed a violation of human rights. Now I want to give a bit overview of what I've just said, because I think I may have said it in bits and pieces that it doesn't make sense. So let's stay on this, then I'll give an overview again and come back and proceed. So beginning, I said we have difficulties defining corruption. So we resort to the idea that corruption can be anything that can lead to decay. So depending on your definition, legal definition that you have, corruption can be any of those acts that I showed under different, whether it involves money, it involves people, it involves power or property. So any of those acts, if they are regarded as corruption in your country, then let's analyze them to see if they lead to the violation of human rights. And then the next point would be, so how do you link corruption to the violation of human rights? First, you need to understand which human rights we are talking about. So these are human rights that Indonesia, for example, has subscribed to. If Indonesia is a states party to the United Nations Convention on Socioeconomic Rights, yeah, it is, right? So we go to that UN Covenant on Socioeconomic and Cultural Rights. Next step, we look at the obligations under that convention. And most human rights treaties have this, what is called the tripartite obligations. So you have that duty to respect, the states have the duty to respect, promote, and fulfill. So we look at those three duties and see how does a specific act of corruption lead to the violation of that obligation that the state owes you. And now the linking itself, we can do it in three ways. One is directly. So we look at the specific act of corruption and see how that is linked to a human rights violation. And in some cases, it is pretty much straightforward, where we have a direct violation of human rights because of corruption. I gave an example of paying a judicial officer a bribe to find a case in your favor. There is a clear direction or a clear violation of the violation of to fair trial of the other party who has not paid because of that bribe that was paid to a judicial officer. So the payment of another example, classic example that shows a direct violation of human rights due to corruption is when you pay a police officer to beat up somebody so that they can adjust you have committing a crime. So let's say they are poor investigatory skills and you believe somebody has stolen from you, you pay a police officer to say, this is the person, arrest this person. So there is a clear direction of, the denial of right to freedom of that other person who is the victim because of the payment of the bribe. So there is a clear causal connection. The second way to show that link between corruption and human rights violation is indirectly. So here you can show that even though it's indirect, but this specific act of corruption has somehow contributed to the violation of my human right. And I gave an example there. The third one, remotely, where I say that corruption will be amongst many other issues. Let's say there is a rigging of an election, and because of that rigging of an election, you decide to go on a demonstration, and because you're involved in a demonstration, you are injured during the demonstration. So the rigging of an election, which is an act of corruption, will be remotely connected to injuries that you have sustained. In this case, it is a bit difficult to then show what is called causal connection under international human rights law. So now let me go a little bit more specific into some of the issues that you need to prove in order to then maintain this causal link. So step by step, I hope you got it step by step, where, you know, the process of how you can make that link between corruption and human rights violations. Yeah, Professor, yeah. This one.
Thank you, Professor Prosper. I want to know about direct violation towards human rights and indirect violation towards human rights as well, and the remote violation towards human rights. I take it relating to corruption and human rights. I want to have a clear explanation from Professor Prosper, because I know that you are a great expert, mainly in criminal law, including corruption laws. I want to know what is the meaning of the human rights. Is the human right the offender or the guilty officer, or the human rights could be understood as the human rights of people, of society in general, due to corruption by the public officer. That's right.
Thank you
That's
very
all.
much. Thank you. That's why it's important that you raise questions if we have, because then it helps me to then elucidate some of the, you know, this relationship, to deconstruct this relationship between corruption and human rights. Otherwise, if I look too much on the slides, I end up sometimes wondering. Very good. So now, first of all, when it comes, one thing that I did not mention in the beginning, by the way, when it comes to corruption and human rights. So the moment you see these two, corruption and human rights, or the relationship between corruption and human rights, when you see it written on textbook covers also, it can mean different things, by the way. It can mean corruption, the relationship between corruption and human rights can mean what is the relationship between corruption and the violation of human rights, you know? Corruption and violation of human rights. Is corruption leading to the violation of human rights? Or it means what is the relationship between the human rights of the accused people, those who are accused of corruption? They also have their rights that need to be safeguarded. We cannot just pass anti-corruption laws that says you can, you know, take people's property if we just believe they are corrupt without giving them a chance to even protect or defend themselves. You know, that's possible. In other countries, they have laws that says if you cannot explain how you get a property, it's taken from you. Actually, the presumption of innocence is taken away. So you have to prove yourself innocent you are already guilty until you prove yourself innocent. So that's also the other aspect of corruption and human rights, that we need to protect the rights of those people accused of corruption. So that's second. Thirdly, we have heard so many stories. I don't know here if this is common, but if you look, check newspapers, Gambia is a good example, many other states, even in Europe, by the way, very close to my university, in Full University, a journalist who was involved in investigating the mafia that is selling drugs in Amsterdam was shot down and killed. So it can also mean the protection of those people who are fighting the corruption war. So when you say corruption and human rights, we may mean any one of these three things. One, corruption and the violation of human rights. So is corruption linked to the violation of human rights? Two, the human rights of the people accused of corruption, which are also equally important, by the way, because any fight against corruption should also be grounded under the rule of law. Nobody is above the law, but nobody is also under it. So we should also treat suspects of corruption with give them all the rights to fair trial. We don't just confiscate their property without also considering that they may have the actual legitimate claim to the property. And the third one is the protection of those who are exposing human corrupt practices, because they are exceptionally at risk. Many people, they are called anti-corruption defenders. Anti-corruption defenders are at risk from those people who are corrupt. They are targeted, they are killed, they are injured and so forth. So these are the usually three topics that comes to mind when we talk about corruption and human rights, the relationship. So that is one thing. The other question was, so I wasn't taking this down, but your other question was then, so what's that, the linkages, those 1, 2, 3 linkages. And then again, as I said that, so we have been fighting corruption. There have been studies on anti-corruption based on culture, based on society, or sometimes even based on that weather condition that, in some countries they are too warm. Western, southern countries are too warm. That also promotes them to be lazy and therefore corrupt. In other countries where there is snow and all that, people are active, jacked up, and less corruption. And then you would look at the corruption index, you see that those Nordic countries where it's very cold, they actually perform much better. And those countries where it's very warm, they actually perform poor. But that's a misconception. That's a myth. The thing is that the criminal approach has not really yielded results. All the other approaches have not yielded results. So some people are thinking that we could actually make a powerful approach to fighting corruption by using the human rights approach. Human rights approach has certain advantages that it brings if we include it in the fight against corruption. For example, we already have the International Criminal Court. We could also use that same court to fight corruption. We already have certain mechanisms under the International Human Rights Framework that we can also use to fight corruption. But more importantly, when it comes, for example, to socio-economic rights, the easiest way to show that there's been a violation or that there's been corruption is to analyze those obligations that the state owes to its citizens. And we said under human rights framework, we have the duty to respect, promote, and fulfill. So if you can show that because the Minister of Education, he has taken 50 billion rupees from the state budget to buy a nice SUV or to buy a nice house in Dubai, that is a violation of my right to education, because that money was meant to go towards education. So there is a link here between the stealing of money and the denial or the shortages of textbook in an education institution. So these are the different links that you can have. You can also show this link that it is indirect, but at the same time, it does lead to the violation of my human right, albeit indirectly. It is still a violation of my human right. Then,
Dr. Prosper,
yes.
Sorry for interrupting you. Your time is over, so you might conclude in 5 minutes.
Okay, so yeah, and so I think in a nutshell, then it shows. I hope I've answered that. So this is why we need these human rights to include the human rights framework in fighting corruption, because so far all the other methods that we have tried have not really yielded results. So let's try now to use the human rights approach to fight corruption. And also, more importantly, just as a way of summing up, corruption for many years has been regarded as a victimless crime. So if you hear that, or you open the newspaper and you see that they are saying that in the Ministry of Finance in Jakarta, 50 billion was never accounted for, or the Auditor General, I don't know if you have what is called the Auditor General, who does audit government books. If they say that by end of year, we could not account for 10 billion in the education sector, you just read it and say, okay, money is missing, so what? But it's not money missing from your bank account, right? Yeah. So you think that corruption is a victimless crime. But if we now use this human rights approach, and you think that, oh, by the way, that money that was stolen, that is said to be missing from the Ministry of Health, and that money could have been used to buy COVID vaccines, that would have helped us to, to save many different lives that were lost. So then you now have a victim of corruption. So you now see that person who fell ill for days and could not go out because they did not receive a vaccine because the ministry has taken some of the money to buy private things. So then there is a human face. So it helps to identify the victim of corruption and demystify again that myth that corruption is a victimless crime. Corruption does have victims. And if we put a face to the victim of corruption, it's another way also in helping to eradicate corruption. Otherwise, people would say, so what? It doesn't concern me. So these are some of the reasons why we should, or at least I'm forcibly saying this is why we should at least try to use the human rights-based approach to fight corruption, to give it a human face, but also to combine resources with those who have already been in the fight for the protection of human rights, so that we can borrow from their expertise to help reduce corruption, which by so far has been proving to be an undefeatable enemy. With this, and please allow me, then I'll stop. So now there is another challenge. This is a promising idea, right? Nobody object with using the fighting corruption against human rights. I hope, I don't know if there's anyone with an objection to using the human rights framework to fighting corruption. Okay, we totally agree. Yeah, although we totally agree that we can use the human rights to fight corruption, there are certain challenges. The human rights framework itself is not a perfect framework, especially the universal human rights framework. It is already under serious challenges. One, there are others who think that the universal human rights approach is too Western. So they think it's too Western. In any case, human rights are also being violated anyway. So why should we then take resources from the human rights and put them into corruption when we haven't stopped even dealing with the human rights violations that are occurring all over the world? So that's another approach. And it's a contested area of human rights. So they say if we are going to bring this human rights framework into the anti-corruption framework, we are going to weaken the anti-corruption framework, by importing problems from the human rights-based approach into the anti-corruption work. One of which is that issue of universalism, that some states, they say these human rights that you talk of, they are not our human rights. We have our own human rights here, so we don't want them. In the same way, they would then reject any anti-corruption approach that is linked to a universal human rights approach. So this is where I say, now let's localize this human rights-based approach. Let's use our own values, the Pancasila values. Now, do we see any connection? Can we now then say, agree that we use the international human rights approach to fight corruption, but the localized understanding of human rights, in this case, the Pancasila values? What is the role that the Pancasila values can play in the fight against corruption from the human rights-based approach perspective? So this is the question that I was trying to put to you in the past 30 or so minutes. And unfortunately, we ran out of time because this is, again, a very long session that requires maybe a day or so of discussion. But if you can then allow me, at least we can have some time for some question and answer segment. And of course, ask if you have any questions, then this is the time we can discuss. Thank you. Yeah, sure. The mic to Baptiste. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the insightful lecture from Dr. Prosper. Now we proceed to Q&A session. So please raise your hand and then mention your name, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prosper. My name is Sang Baptiste Mendy. I just want to make a comment, which is like corruption fighting corruption using a human rights approach. I think using human rights approach is kind of a weak mechanism to fight corruption. Still, I don't find it too convincing because it's going to take a long time for corruption to be over. Like we cannot finish complete fighting corruption. So if there is any other method where we can maybe use and fight corruption, yeah. But human rights approach, because like you just mentioned, in other countries, they don't, some human rights are not accepted as human rights and others. So I just want to know if there is any other way we can fight corruption. Thank you.
Yes, sure. Thank you so much for your questions, Sam Baptist Mendy. Now we proceed to the other question, please. Okay, please, Nanda.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much, sir, for the very insightful lectures. So I'm going to ask about what you've been said before about the link between the corruption and the impact of it regarding of the human rights. So if like what you've said before, for example, like about the destruction of public facility, for example, as the impact, or the real impact of demonstrations during the process of demonstration, or maybe like the traffic jam also, like the real impact of demonstrations. I would like to ask and maybe emphasize, you can emphasize one more time about who is to blame on and who is the offender of that. Is it the one who does the destruction or the one who did the corruption? Because I think they do like the vandalism, for example, or maybe destruct the public facilities because they protect their deed under the name of freedom of expression as one of the example of human rights. So yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Nanda. So we have one more, please.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm interested with your presentations regarding three obligations of state to be fulfilled. And the last point is how state obligate to fulfill the needs of the society or even for these public servants, right? I think what is the reason recent discussions here in Indonesia, how we are against the corruptions, is caused by another unpredictable cause, which is the fact that in Indonesia most perpetrators and corruptor was politicians, right? The most of scholars, most of lecturer or observer of the politic dynamics observe this. It caused by political cost in Indonesia is so much high. So when they are already have the power, they need to turn back their money that they have expense before during campaign, for example, and so on and so forth. So I don't think so that to fulfill this need, the reasons of why they are doing corruptions is they need the money because they came from privileged society. So I think the approaches is nowadays is too abstract for us to identifying why they are doing these corruptions, and then it is not relevant anymore to talk that they are need this kind, and government didn't feel the basic needs of this, for example, a public officer and so on and so forth. So what do you think about it?
Okay, very interesting questions. We have another round, I hope, please. Yeah, so I'll be very quick with my answers as well. First of all, so the human rights-based approach. So, Son Baptiste, there are different approaches that have been tried. And as I said, even first of all, corruption, there was nothing wrong with corruption. It's only until 1980, it's only 79 when the United States passed the first legislation against corruption. Before that, no other country in the world had passed any laws against corruption. In Ghana, they had actually an office where you would go and pay bribes. If you want to get a contract for the government, it was encouraged that you pay me something before I give you, and then they said, oh, okay, now let's have a criminal approach. This thing is now unnecessary tax on the poor, then they started seeing the negative impact of corruption. But even then there was a debate with other scholars believing that no, corruption is actually helping to do business where bureaucracy is and red tape is, where other things make it difficult to do business. Yeah. There is also survival corruption. You want to go abroad, you got a scholarship, and the government official is telling you that if you pay me $20, I'll get you your passport within 3 days. Otherwise, you do the normal way, it will take you 6 months. Meanwhile, the scholarship is expired, or it will take you 2 years. So in this case, you pay $20, and it really allows you to go abroad and study and realize your right to education. So that is called also survival corruption. So corruption needs to be distinguished and put. That's why I say that it's very important. We have a very good understanding of the term. What is it that we define as corruption? And then we use this human rights-based approach. To my knowledge, to the best of my knowledge, all the criminal approach is not worked. In China, where they have a death sentence and you'll be executed, if it's not a lie, I heard that you'll be executed the same very day where you are charged. They will charge you with corruption, convict you, pass a judgment that you should be executed, and within hours you are taken out and you are executed. But corruption is still rampant, even though they have that death sentence. So the criminal approach has not really yielded results. So it's time to try other different approaches. That's why I say, can we not explore maybe the Pancasila values and see how about catching people from a tender age and help them to understand the negative impact of corruption. That brings me, okay, so for now I leave it there, and I want to answer this question, although it's not remotely related to the issue of corruption. Who is responsible? So yeah, corruption does have negative impact, by the way, much more than what we think. A stealing of an election leading to a civil strife, and then in a civil strife, material or public institutions, facilities are damaged, and all that bad things happen. Who should take the responsibility? Of course, the primary responsibility still lies with those corrupt officials for initiating an act of corruption that has angered the republic, the nation. If you look at the Arab Spring, because of corruption, one man set himself on fire and set the whole region on fire. So that was the responsibility of those who have been in power for too many years without, the need to feel that they should relinquish and go and rest. But of course, this is now just my, advice that when you do take part in demonstrations, you need to observe the law. Do everything you can legally. Freedom of expression does not mean, freedom to do everything you want. Any human rights have limitations, with a few exceptions like torture. But all the other human rights, they are not absolute rights. They should be enjoyed in a way that don't violate the rights of others. When you destroy property that belongs to another person, you are also violating their right to property. So you should also enjoy your right or your freedom of expression without also violating the rights of others. That's just in a nutshell. Then the issue of political campaigns, political corruption, and that, people, they get into power, then they are corrupt because they are probably trying to recover money that they've used in campaigning. So there's also the need to deal with corruption in that area. I don't know how far corruption with political campaigns is regulated. Even other countries are still struggling with the way, political corruption can have negative impact. In the United States, for example, there's something they call lobbying. Lobbying, you pay people who are called lobbyists in Washington, DC. They are paid a lot of money, by the way. Some of them charges $20,000 an hour. And they'll tell you that if you give me this amount of money, I can arrange for a meeting with you with Senator so-and-so, or I can arrange a meeting with you with President Joe Biden. And you pay them millions. Companies pay them $5 million. You pay lobbyists millions of dollars so they can go and influence a congressman that a certain law should not be passed banning cigarettes. In America, it's actually legal to pay lobbyists to do that kind of work. In other countries, that could also be regarded as corruption, right? So I don't really know exactly what Indonesian laws say about it, but there is always a need to keep regulate. That's why we should move away from that definition that says corruption is abuse of office and power, and see corruption as decay. Anything that just leaves you with a with a bad taste in the mouth should be is decay. It's rotten. Should be defined as corruption. So paying somebody, to do dirty work, bad job, to block effective legislation should also in this regard be viewed as corruption. So that's why I started with the definition and say that we need to go beyond these definitions that have been suggested to us by international organizations such as the World Bank and the IMF and find the solution within our own tradition. What is it that our ancestors were using to define corruption? There lies the solution. Okay, and maybe moderator, if you just give us one more round and we're done. I don't know.
Is it possible? 5 minutes. 5 minutes. So maybe one more questions if it's okay. The last one.
Okay, thank you, sir. It's an honor for attending these discussions. And I want to ask about I was interested about the relations between the corruptions and human rights, especially the protections of the witness, whistleblower, and justice collaborator for human rights, because we know they must be protected by law enforcement. But when the law enforcement involved in the corruption case, because several cases, when the law enforcement involved in this, they try to silence the eyewitness, the whistleblower, and justice collaborator. So does any international law regulate the protection of them? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, so that is also ties to what was asked by Professor Marcel and also Sangbaptiste to answer again why we need the human rights-based approach. So now when we talk about corruption, I say corruption, human rights also means protecting those who are fighting to expose corruption. There is the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, which is good news is it has been subscribed to, it has been signed and ratified by more than 180 countries. So it's now sort of becoming international customer law, and the meaning that all the countries will one day be bound by these values that are in the statute, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. It does have a provision that says member states should pass what are called whistleblower protection laws, but unfortunately in practice many states are not yet at that level. Some are still in the process of coming up with these laws to protect whistleblowers, to protect those who are fighting to expose corruption. But there are laws, there are obligations, and states are in the process. If your country has not yet one, of course, then there's a duty to keep lobbying them that they should pass laws to protect whistleblowers. Otherwise, they will not be able to get enough evidence to prosecute corrupt people. And because also corruption happens in secrecy, so we really rely on evidence by those who may have been eyewitnesses or somehow have key information on corrupt activities. So very important. There is a law still in the implementation process. And then one last round, also the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, every 4 years, a country is reviewed. So they review a country to see how far it has gone in implementing this convention, including passing legislation to protect whistleblowers. So every time when there's that round, you should also, as academics, write papers, push to make sure that, a country passes this legislation. I think Professor Marcel, you had a question. Yeah. Oh, can you pass on the mic? Oh, wait, we are done. So it's
I ask you, do you agree that the Commission Against Corruption as established in Indonesia since 2020, so that it's a long time, our commission in Indonesia, Commission Against Corruption, so long time it has been established. But as the commission is established actually for the time being, for temporal time or for temporal period. Because, as we know, it is established, or it has been established.
Sorry to interrupt, Prof. Sorry to interrupt you. I think I'm really wanted, and we have to end. If you can just in the next 30 seconds complete the question.
As long as any traditional or conventional institutions of law enforcement have not been exercising their functions in the field of enforcement, in handling, in investigating, and prosecuting the crimes of corruption involving public officer or private persons damaging the state items. Although the Commission against Corruption has been established since a long time ago, since 2020. Nevertheless, the traditional institutions like General Prosecutor, Police Department have not been functional until now, have not been functionalized as far, with the result that such the traditional or conventional institutions for law enforcement must be defended. Do you agree with this?
Thank you. Yes, indeed. And then that's actually the best way to then conclude that we have also these institutions, dedicated institutions, corruption commissions, but they need also to have their independence. And they only support the work of the traditional institutions. So these are special mechanisms. When you have an anti-corruption commission, ombudsman, I don't know if you have an ombudsman here, when you have such institutions, they are only special mechanisms, but they need to support traditional institutions, and they should also have their independence. So with this, I thank you all for your attentive listening. Thank you.
So, okay, thank you so much for the profound lecture by Dr. Prosper, and thank you so much for the question from participants. Now we still wait, or is it possible to have one questions?
Yes.
Okay, so we still have time for one questions. Please, everyone, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Okay, please, Bapak Dr. Zulfan.
Thank you, Dr. Prosper. You talk about Pancasila early. So what is our traditional tool to fight corruption for? So maybe you already know about this. I believe that you have the research all the way back from more than 1 year. So we are fully aware of what Pancasila is. We are educated about Pancasila since we are elementary school. But yet in the view of from some of our public officials, it just not very much consideration, since all the public officials know about Pancasila, and if they implemented the Pancasila very well, there will be no corruption in Indonesia. Some say that this is a very religious country, but yet some of our leaders, as people who have educated about religion from their basic, like from their mother or their father, but that is the perpetrator anyway. So what is maybe your research result that have been, maybe we can have a little more, little bit enlightenment about how can Pancasila be very important to our, but how to be
to keep corruption, just
to keep corruption just away from us.
Yes,
It
sure.
is a different.
Thank you. I understand the question, and that's a very good one. So also, when it comes to corruption, one of the reasons why I started by trying to break down different aspects of corruption is to also help you understand that different forms of corruption requires different forms of mechanisms. So we have, we are told that we have rich politicians, they are already rich, but they still get corrupt. We have sometimes also poor civil servants. They are paid poorly and they are corrupt. They will require a different method to deal with that kind of corruption. Maybe increasing salaries would help deal with corruption. Increasing salary of a rich politician does not deal with corruption. So we need to break down corruption in its different elements, see which type of corruption and how a specific value under the Pancasila values philosophy can be channeled towards getting rid of that kind of corruption. So if we have issues of a problem with citizens offering bribes to public officials, they are the ones who start by, hey, can I offer you this and you do something for me? Then how do we deal with citizens to understand that this is a bad thing to offer incentives to public officials? At the high level, how do we then use Pancasila values, maybe even to change the law, to say that an act of trying to recover the money that you use to campaign is even though we cannot link it to any abuse of office, is a bad practice and should be penalized. And I can give you an example of Japan. Post-World War Japan, they had this definition of corruption, abuse of power, and so forth, but they could not prosecute top officials. They decided to do away with this Western definition and employ their own traditional moral values called Takasima. And with those values, they were able to convict most of these difficult cases of corruption using traditional concepts. So the same thing can be done also using Pancasila values to deal with certain aspects of corruption and using them also to educate certain type of citizens to deal with certain aspects of corruption. So we need to break it down so that we can come up with appropriate tailor-made solutions. So this, in a nutshell, is one way we could actually use the values to deal with corruption at different levels in the society. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Prosper, for the answers. Now, I close these sessions, but before that, please give one big round of applause for Dr. Prosper. Thank you so much, Dr. Prosper. Now I hand it over to the Master of Ceremony.
Check. All right, that's presentation from Dr. Prosper S. Magocho. Let us applause or give. That's a big applause to Dr. Prosper Magocho. And yeah, let's jump to the last agenda, which is closing. Before we come to the end of the session, we would like to give the token of appreciation to our amazing speaker, Dr. Prosper S. Magucu, that will be represented by Dean Faculty of Law, Universitas Hasanuddin, Profesor Dr. Hamzah Halim, SHMH.
Sebelum kita sampai pada akhir sesi ini, kami ingin memberikan tanda terima kasih kepada pembicara kami yang sangat luar biasa, Dr. Prosper S. Magucu, LLM, yang akan diberikan oleh Dekan Fakultas Hukum Universitas Hasanuddin, Bapak Profesor Dr. Hamzah Halim, SHMH, MAP.
Finally, we've come to the last agenda in this activity, that is closing. Let's close today's activity by saying Hamdallah, and we humbly please to all participants to come forward for documentation purposes. We also invite the speaker, lecturer, and all the audiences to be involved in our photo session.
Tanpa mengurangi rasa hormat, kami memohon kepada seluruh peserta untuk maju ke depan untuk keperluan dokumentasi. Kami juga mengundang pembicara, dosen, dan semua peserta untuk bergabung dalam sesi foto bersama.
Ya, jadi Fakultas Hukum UNAS, who is the best? Oke. Oke. Fakultas Hukum UNAS, who is the best?
Langsung,